Hello everyone, today we look at a very interesting period in papal history that is between the early 30s and the early 50s of the 12th century. I already made a video about the secular, let's say, side of the story that are the Italic reigns of Lothair III and Conrad III of Germany. This is a phase of reaffirmation of the Germanic Empire in Italy after the defeat against the papacy at the Concordat of Worms that we also discussed in other videos early on, chronological, as you know, here in the 12th century. So just actually a decade before these events, the consequences, I think, are pretty well known. The German monarchy suffered a very heavy destructuring at the hands, essentially, of the princes of the empire, who decided mostly to exploit the investiture controversy to undermine public authority and also to further, in fact, feudalize, privatize the investiture systems. We've seen it for also the episcopal ones, etc. The sort of simplistic narrative is, okay, like after the Salients, there is basically nobody until Frederick Barbarossa that is able to reassert an authority in Italy. This is really not true. There is actually a great continuity under many points of view, at least, of these rulers in as far as the Italic crown was concerned. Actually, these were even good, positive reigns in central northern Italy, with a wide negotiation between the sovereigns and the local communities. Today, we look, however, at the central and southern part of Italy at the same time, and therefore the relations between the papacy, the revival of Germanic authority that is still, however, floating. It's intermittent. It's not like these kings were for any particularly protracted time in the peninsula. Instead, the Siculo-Normans are. The Byzantines are also looming. When we will talk more in depth about Frederick Barbarossa's many expeditions to Italy, we will see how sort of intricate this picture is. Today, we do not talk about the newly born communes. I have, again, other videos dealing with that, including, in fact, the ones about Lothair III and Conrad III's Italic reigns. Today we look at this interplay that was essentially still going on between the two Roman monarchies and the Norman one in the south, as far as, say, papal control went. We start from Innocent II's pontificate, when his recreated papal curia pursued a political strategy centered on collaboration with the Holy Roman Emperor, as it was also, generally speaking, the norm, especially after the settlement of the investiture controversy, but at times also in between, depending on the situation. As a minimal background, by 1133, Pope Innocent II and King Lothair III of Germany had formed a significant alliance that shaped the political and religious landscape of the continent. Innocent had been elected in 1130 amidst a papal schism against Anacletus II, and by this time had garnered considerable support from European rulers and clergy, largely thanks to the persuasive efforts of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the author of the famous De Laude Nova Militia, if you are interested in the Templars, in the monastic chivalric orders. But I made lots of videos on that. We'll come back on the topic soon. Lothair III had become instead King of Germany in 1125 after a contentious election, part of the consequences of the investiture controversy and power fragmentation of the land, opposed by the Hohenstaufen family. Lothair was a Saxon. The Hohenstaufen were Swabians, so the usual contrast between northern and southern Germany. Not only, but still. Lothair was in this supported by Innocent II, because in part some would conventionally called geopolitical reasons, even though geopolitics does not exist. Of course, a strong Swabian house would have, as it happened later, as we will see today as well with the Hohenstaufen, would have reactivated a sort of intervention in Italy that the Pope was trying to mitigate. It's not like Lothair, in fact, wouldn't come to Italy. We will see it now. In fact, even from that, some problems would arise. But tendentially, this was the Saxon house that would counterbalance the Hohenstaufen. In fact, the anti-Pope Anacletus was instead backed by the Swabians. Lothair III of Germany was crowned emperor at the Lateran Basilica in Rome on June the 4th, 1133. That's where we start. This ruler was esteemed in Innocence circles as a devout emperor, a formidable warrior, known for his bravery, wisdom in council, and commitment to justice. Think what a northern German monarch could be in those years. We just made multiple videos about 12th century warfare, knighthood, etc. These were people embroiled in very deep feuds, especially as we were talking about with the Hohenstaufen, in a war-torn country. And the fact that he had proposed himself as the protector, the papacy had agreed essentially against some sort of guarantees not to expand the imperial control over especially the papal territories, the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, was very well seen upon by Innocent. In the Vita Norberti Archiepiscopi Magdeburgensis, which is the life of Norbert, the Archbishop of Magdeburg, this is a Saxon source, chapter 21, we get this relatively flattering picture of Lothair described as a fierce adversary of God's enemies, in function of this Pfaffenkönig policy, as the German princes that were opposing him at that point would have defined it. It was always the same. Like, if a guy got the papal support and was made emperor, of course, by a degree, there weren't other supporters but the Pope for that, and he would be looked upon with suspicion by those at least that were siding against him, that when instead came to power and would require the papal crowning, of course, would suddenly change idea. Lothair was nostalgically viewed in the papal curia of that time as an exemplary ruler, particularly for his military campaign that he led against the Normans in Italy from 1136 to 1137. Here there is a very interesting balance of power that entails the Germanic Empire, the papacy, the Siculo-Normans, the Komnenian Byzantines, the Turks, the Crusader states, France, every one you can imagine. We made multiple videos, especially about Byzantine history, about the same era, that instead, as far as Western affairs, as we will see today, deserves a lot of attention, because one simply said, okay, there were these powers, more or less, they had the same, they were following the same directions. Now, it was all very complicated, because the Germans wanted historically to reassert control on southern Italy as a gateway to the east, and so potentially to the reunification of the Mediterranean basin, thus of the Christian churches, the conquest of Constantinople, to a degree, inspirationally, at least eliminating the Byzantine presence from certain other areas like the Adriatic. There is, as you know, under the Komnenians, a revival of imperial power that is bothering the Germans a bit. Also, there are the Normans that, while being vassals to the papacy, are also a disproportionately powerful polity that at times is also competitive with the papacy itself. And in this case, Lothair had been called to Italy to combat Roger II of Hauteville, essentially the first proper king of Sicily, which was, as you know, a title that was bestowed upon the Siculo-Norman rulers in a unitary sense for all of, say, Sicily, southern Italy, only in fact in this early 12th century, one of the greatest rulers of the era, that had great ambitions, including on papal territories. So Lothair arrives and he manages to defeat Roger, right? And even expelling him from the Italian mainland. So this guy came back to Sicily, where essentially the capital of the kingdom was. Normally, we talk about southern Italy a bit also recently in those centuries, and you know how difficult it was to a degree, in spite of the highest level of centralization in the Latin Germanic world for this very realm, to control like the southern Italian mainland, especially the Apenninic heartland, was still populated by, say, rebel barons. Mostly that was the problem. There was also a Longobard substratum. There was this tendential contact with the Byzantines from the side of many coastal centers. There are different sources you can check out about this period. For example, Innocent III's, so we are at the end of the same century, Registrum de Negotio Imperi, right? Because sometimes we get documented about this stuff only later, from later sources. If you look at chapter 32 and you give it a read, you will find lots of interesting stuff there. Lothair's campaign against Roger II of Sicily in 1136-37 was part of a broader conflict involving, as we've seen, papal and imperial interests, initiated at the urging of Pope Innocent II. And the same Byzantine Emperor John II Comnenus, I made a video about him, Lothair III set out with a sizable army to challenge Roger's control over southern Italy as a whole. You understand why the Byzantines would want that. The secular Normans were by far the most dangerous threat to Byzantine existence at this point. In fact, they will essentially mount up under Manuel Comnenus an expedition to almost successfully wipe out, as facts will prove, the secular Norman kingdom that, however, resisted, also carrying out a very impressive counterattack, like with coordinated amphibious operations, pretty wide theater. We'll talk about that campaign at a point. The campaign, so this was a moment in which you realize that more or less papal, German, and Byzantine interests are relatively aligned. At least they consistently overlap, because the papacy saw Lothair as too, say, distant from his northern German bases to bother Italy more than much. They had this problem with the Normans. The Germans wanted to reassert control in the southern Italian lands that in part had technically, at least aspirationally, belonged to the empire, because there was the old duchy of Benevent that, as you know, had technically been part of the Longobard kingdom, but the Carolingians never quite fully extended direct control on it, and though they carried out campaigns on that, the Byzantines too had tried to, in fact, regain all that area. The Byzantines also want the Normans destroyed, so they are relatively eager to risk, even for a German success in southern Italy that could reinforce the rival sort of western half of the empire, as long as the Normans were sort of fragmented, pulverized, because they understood it's not like the Germans could simply fix the Labarum in southern Italy and simply rule it, right? The papacy itself would have not allowed it. The papacy was in contact with the Byzantines, so it's a very complicated picture. In any case, the campaign of Lothair saw two columns of forces, one led by Lothair himself and the other by his son-in-law Henry the Proud, converge in Italy. They advanced into Apulia in the southeast, capturing Termoli in today's Molise, and pushing further south, where they laid siege to and took Bari in 1137. Bari was essentially the most important center in Apulia, and city of strong Greek tradition, some sort. They will be, in fact, a bit too treacherous with the Normans later on that will raze it to the ground. In any case, the campaign did face numerous challenges, as you can understand from this sort of pretty stretched supply lines. mostly from the Italic kingdom, from Germany. The German troops revolted against campaigning in the hot summer, which in southern Italy is something. And there were disputes with Innocent II over the control of the same Apulia, because obviously now, yes, the Normans had been sort of beaten, but the who did control the area, right? Technically, all this southern Italian mainland constituted a papal fief, and so there was the old problem about what is temporal authority, what is sacred authority, the same regnum sacerdotium controversy. Lothair would have liked to keep it for himself, but the Pope had other plans. Ultimately, Lothair was unable to achieve his goal of conquering Sicily, which is also a bit too much out of range. Instead, he managed, however, it was important to capture Capua in addition to Apulia. So on the Tyrrhenian side, it was a consistent, as you know, market center, very important city in Campania since antiquity, which he then bestowed upon Roger's enemies. So he couldn't, but of course in an eminently feudal reality, to such far away from his basis of power to entheofit or sub-entheofit to some local Italo-Norman barons. An agreement was particularly reached where Apulia was bequeathed to Reinulf of Alife, we'll talk about him later, by both the emperor and the pope, with his campaign falling short of conquering Sicily and facing internal dissent. Lothair decided to return to Germany, but he died on the journey back in December 1137. The papal narrative conveniently omitted the fact that this military victory achieved by the Germans over the Normans swiftly revealed a serious disagreement regarding the rights to the Duchy of Apulia between the Pope and the Emperor. Because at that point, when these sources were written, like also different situation existed. I mean, think about the sudden death of Lothair itself. Now, from the papal standpoint, Lothair's intervention was seen, of course, as an act of defense for the Roman Church and the territorial rights of St. Peter. Also because the Normans, in spite of the general obedience to the Church, the fact that it was an enormous deal of papal power in the management of the southern Italian episcopate and so on, it was also pretty big, pretty sizable, and hence causing these attritions, was in fact quite aggressive. The Normans back in the day, in the previous century, had even sacked Rome. There had been, at the retreat of the Germans, by the way, they were also not there just to make a favor to the Pope entirely. The very brutal tensions, and the Siculo-Normans and the Eastern Franks did not really like each other very much. In contrast, the imperial viewpoint had asserted that literally, this is what the Annales of Romuald of Salerno, a southern Italian chronicler, dating this work dating to 1136, quote, Apulia and Sicily belong to Lothair's imperial jurisdiction. Right? This is very interesting because you don't often see this imperial, or at least we are habituated to the idea of Guelph Ghibellines in southern Italy, at least after the Hohenstaufen. Under the Hohenstaufen, just Ghibelline, nobody has much to say about that, and after is Guelph under the Angevins. But before this time, the imperial papal issue was felt also by the southern Italian subjects to a degree that could take this, say, the term Guelph Ghibelline is a bit anachronistic at this point because it was not part of the vocabulary at the time, but at least this pro-imperial stance, right? In ways you want to appreciate, we're talking about areas that had historically belonged to the Longobards, right? So it's fascinating to read sources like these. That's where we get to the Count Reinulf of Alife. That was an ambitious vassal of Roger II. Innocent sought to appoint him as Duke of Apulia, so reflecting the papal political theory of idoneitatis, over hereditary claims as the appropriate basis for secular office. This is quite interesting because it was not just, in theory, like an imperial ideology, but in this sense, you see the papacy, an imperial isn't a traditional ideology, of course, but the papacy sort of switching roles, like deciding, as far as that land was concerned, who could be the secular ruler, so inverting the investiture controversy in terms of which kind of authority had to appoint whom. As I discussed in those videos about southern Italy, we don't talk about it enough, really. We have to make up for that. But Reinulf of Alife is a very interesting knight of this era. He had been born around 1093 into the influential Drengot family, that, as you know, were the first Normans with Reinulf back in the day, that in fact it's the namesake of the current guy, receiving the county of Aversa as the first Norman fief in southern Italy ever, like eventually losing it. Then the Hauteville rivalry was messy, but you understand that these clans had remained and had become vassals of the Siculo-Normans. Reinulf of Alife was at this point a key player in the politics of Norman-controlled southern Italy. As the son of Robert, Count of Alife and Caiazzo, and grandson of Reinulf I of Caiazzo, he was part of the upper tier of Norman nobility. By 1127, following Duke William II of Apulia's death, Reinulf was already established as Count of Alife and Caiazzo himself. He opposed Roger II of Sicily's claim to the very Duchy of Apulia, thus aligning with Pope Honorius II and leading military resistance against Roger at the same Capua. This is amidst the same German expedition. Despite his marriage to Roger II's sister, Matilda, Reinulf continued his opposition into the 30s of the 12th century, even after initially supporting Innocent II in the Papal Schism. His rebellion against Roger in 1132 led to the Battle of Nocera, where Roger was defeated. Right, this is a famous, important battle. We will make a video about this because there are lots of interesting tactical insight. And by 1136, Reinulf had allied with Robert II of Capua and Sergius VII of Naples against Roger, and with the arrival of Emperor Lothair III and Henry the Proud, he played a crucial role, especially in the siege of Salerno and the subsequent march into Apulia. Here, Reinulf was appointed duke by both Lothair and Innocent, marking the zenith of his political and military influence in the region amidst the complexity, the interplay of Papal, Imperial, and Sicilian power struggles. The same Lothair had been insistent on bestowing the duchy upon the new Duke of Apulia to affirm his jurisdiction, so it's not like the Pope was... the investiture controversy had continued while all these individuals were present at the same time. It was obvious in such sort of a frontier area. When they traveled together lacking documents or evidence, by the way, they struggled to resolve their dispute. This was incredibly important already at the time, having a written basis. The papacy especially was master in preservation of, as you know, antiquities, privileges. They came from an enormously advanced, cultural background, administration, like literary practice. The Germans were a bit clumsier in that, but they also had learned the craft, especially ever since they had become emperors from the 10th century. However, traveling, especially during a military campaign, was a different story, and of course matters had to be settled not during a military campaign but in the adequate palaces of power, in a council or something. Consequently, that's when Reinulf is invested as Duke of Apulia, because both the Pope and the Emperor invest him to say, okay, well, we did it in the same way, then we will settle the matter of what pertains to whom, with the Pope holding the standard atop and the Emperor positioned below, interestingly enough, this is from the Annales of the aforementioned Romuald, 1137. Despite this tension and competition, Lothair was vital to Innocent's efforts against Roger II. This is the big elephant in the room. The fact that the Normans had been actually knocked out from southern Italy. It's a big deal. We will surely make more videos, say, from the Norman side of the mirror. And after Lothair's death in 1137, Innocent took the lead in a further coalition against Roger, so supported by Reinulf of Alife and other Italo-Norman rebels. But he was captured himself following his defeat at Galucho on July 22nd, 1139. You remember the Battle of Civitate, in which the Normans captured the Pope, they eventually made the deal, brokered the deal with them as far as the yet-to-be-conquered Sicily was involved, and they became allies, etc. But this inner, unresolved tension and conflict was there. The Battle of Galucho is yet another example of this. It was fought in 1139 between Roger II of Sicily and Innocent II. The battle took place near the town of Galucho in southern Italy, where Roger III, that was Roger of Alife, the Duke of Apulia, who was not Reinulf of Alife, but it was the son of Roger II that had maintained for himself the title of Duke of Apulia, also because Apulia was the most important part of the southern Italian mainland. It's like a huge fertile plateau on the Adriatic, as you know, and as such, like the biggest feudal seigneury you can control. Like the Apennine is massive, but this area is so powerful on its own. It will be also the favorite of Frederick II later on. If you control that, which is also from actually the other side of Sicily, the straits, right? It's very strategic. It's also the gateway to the east. You can control the Otranto Strait. You can create problems to the Venetians. You can live for the crusade there as a launching pad. Also one for invading the Byzantine Empire, for that matter. So Roger III of Apulia, the son of Roger II, ambushed the Saint Pope Innocent with a force of only about 1,000 knights, which is not that few. However, Innocent, who was traveling with a light body of troops, was attempting to muster support in the region against Saint Roger, who was consolidating his power back in the region. The ambush was successful. Innocent and his entourage were captured. Following this victory, 3 days later, on July the 25th, 1139, by the Treaty of Mignano, Innocent was compelled to confirm Roger II's title as King of Sicily. Because this had been partially suspended, now we don't get into the juridical minutiae, but of course, if you're fighting a war against a king, like you declare him deposed, especially if you are the Pope, and this is in theory your fiefdom. Recognize Roger III, not Roger Reinulf of Alife, as Duke of Apulia, and acknowledge other concessions to Roger's family. Thus, this battle not only marked a significant military and diplomatic triumph for Roger, but also highlighted the vulnerability of even the Pope in the tumultuous political landscape of medieval southern Italy. The victor of the Papal Schism was then obligated to reaffirm all concessions to Roger's ally, as well, the aforementioned anti-Pope Anacletus II, essentially reversing the settlement that had been made 9 years before. We know this from also some letters of the Pope. Conrad III, meanwhile, was the new German king. As you know, he was the first Hohenstaufen ruler in the country. He was engaged in warfare against the Welfen in Germany, that were in fact gradually nesting in Bavaria, in Saxony. There was actually an early connection with the Welfen and Italy. These were in fact a branch of the Este clan that had been settled in the Italic kingdom since the times of Charlemagne, right around there, and now had come back to Germany as proponents of this challenge against this powerful Swabian clan. This struggle, as you know, would go on until essentially the end of Conrad's reign, when his nephew, successor Frederick, would rise to the throne. Lots of things are actually going on in the meanwhile. There is later on the Crusades, in fact, in Syria, that is going to be a disaster, the shame of Damascus. In any case, the power of Conrad was less compared to what Lothair's one had been in Italy. He proved unable to replicate his predecessor's actions because of this war that was ravaging the land north of the Alps, which was the main reason why German rulers wouldn't intervene in Italy, because that was their ultimate goal, to obviously pursue the Roman dream. In the meanwhile, in France, Bernard of Clairvaux pleaded for the same Conrad to serve as the advocate of the church. If anything, he may have been inspired by the zeal of crusade, but the Swabian alignment to the papal requests here went suggested by Bernard in the Epistola 244, chapter 3, and later on chapter 183 went ignored. In the subsequent 15 years following the debacle of Galucho, the papal curia faced difficulties countering Roger II's advances into the southern and eastern parts of the very Patrimonium Sancti Petri. This is quite interesting because there is an area that we've never discussed precisely on Schwerpunkt, that are the Abruzzi. Right? For the historical regional series, I've actually prepared one first, albeit early medieval chapter for that. And essentially, you know that the so-called Kingdom of Sicily stretched at this point, as it had properly been established, up to, in fact, essentially what is central Italy. There were significant infiltrations with the Duchy of Spoleto. We have seen it in the video about that polity. And, of course, like, the papacy wasn't in the conditions to simply oppose itself to the secular Normans, that were one of the greatest power of the era. Regional force, the papacy barely controlled the area around Rome. I made multiple videos explaining how this happened. In medieval Lazio, also the turbulence of the Roman factions, the Roman barons especially, in fact the consequent itinerancy of the Roman curia in these towns around Rome. With all these backs and forths, of course, for the Normans was no joke as well. They were exhausted, and taking over even a provincial sized land is difficult, especially in the Apennine hinterland of Abruzzo. That is really, like, it's one of the coldest places in Europe. It's very impervious, and in fact even the later kingdoms of Sicily, of Naples, will have a hard time really controlling. That's why the Swabians will found L'Aquila there, that is the eagle fortress city. Abruzzo is also pretty vast, but that's a very interesting area to start infiltrating, and you can do so with different methods, such as giving green lights to your hungry clienteles to unleash their knights and take over different valleys, etc. The problem is always controlling it, especially at this point in history, from Sicily, that, remember, remains the actual base of power for especially the other side of the kingdom. We're talking also some hundreds of kilometers, like, as there, like, the earth widens, and actually, aside from the usual projections, say, were sort of orthogonal projections that show you, I don't know, Scandinavia, like, the biggest country ever. Really, actually, the more you go down in the smallest towards the south, actually it's the other way around. And these are really enormous territories. They're also replete with people, it has an enormous population. They're feudally organized, which to an extent means that they're not even overly organized, regardless of the Siculo-Norman, as we were saying before, centralizing primate here in the picture. We're still talking about first half of 12th century. It's very, very, very difficult to handle everything. But the Pope is definitely losing power along that frontier, and it's really risky. The papacy's troubles were worsened by another phenomenon, that is the Roman uprising of 1143. This is connected with Arnold of Brescia, the spread of heresy across Europe, summed with the communal aspirations of the Roman nobility and people that at large were very self-aware of their power. We often underestimate how powerful Rome was as a city during the Middle Ages. In fact, they managed to literally expel the Pope. The formal reason why Frederick Barbarossa would descend into Italy, aside from the more practical one of dealing with Lombard affairs, was in fact reinstating the Pope in the city. Of course, as we said before, the Pope had different residents, and there were different factions across Lazio and beyond that would help the papacy. But this was an unprecedented move, mostly because, as you know, the communal government was really a novelty. Rome had not developed fully one on its own because of the papal signory that was like the equivalent, as you see also in southern Italy, with essentially the curbing of the local communal autonomies. Southern Italy had the first maritime republics, had an important urban potential. The center and the north were already advanced by this time because they were part of a kingdom of a much more differently handled reality from centuries and centuries. But at large, when you have such powerful feudal presence, that communal autonomy gets curbed. Recently we made a video about 13th century Florence, the signory of Frederick of Antioch. We have pointed out how still the 13th century it was believed that the Italian communes could be simply let's say thwarted in their expansion, and at least sort of prevaricated, surpassed by the restoration of some feudal hierarchy of sort. And here Rome, we are in the mid-12th century, so this is a moment of tumultuous growth of Europe, however in a quite overall disorderly way. This is also the century of the heresies. The papacy is a monarchy from a relatively short time, at least they managed to secure that just in the last 70 years or so, and they have to start disciplining Europe in that kind of unitary fashion in a time in which the Cathars are spreading everywhere as a threat to the Catholic order in the world for reasons that now were mostly populistic in nature. I made multiple videos on the Cathars, on the Albigensian Crusade, etc. We explained the entire background, both politically, theologically, where this had spread from, and so on. Arnold of Brescia was one of these agitators that received like that useful, idiotic, populistic push. Of course, there was a baronial power behind this revolt as well that would weaponize the situation. Because again, the people alone in history never go anywhere, right? There's never, I mean, anything significant was achieved by the mob. But they can be instruments in the right hands. So you understand it's a pretty disastrous situation. This shows you how difficult it is really to remain in charge, to have really even to maintain a specific administrative continuity in a situation of this kind. But the papacy was definitely strong and ancient to know how to handle this. The tumult in Rome that had prompted the 11th century papacy to seek a Norman alliance appeared to be driving Innocent II's successors towards seeking Sicilian royal protection as well. The Siculo-Normans were infesting the Patrimonium, thus what a better support for the rebellious Romans against the Pope. Nonetheless, achieving lasting peace with Roger II in the 40s, 12th century, was complicated by the so-called opposition of the cardinals, because at large the papacy, as the Sicilians wanted a deal. Not all the clergy, however, was supporting Innocent, so for reasons of, again, the Pope is vulnerable at this point. Let's get something for ourselves. Romuald of Salernus Annales for 1143 explain as what this opposition of the cardinals was. Resentments from the 30s lingered among the cardinals. Popes Celestine II, 1143-1144, Lucius II, 1144-45, and Anastasius IV, 53-54, you understand, very short pontificates, had all been electors of Innocent and supporters of Aymeric in 1130. Aymeric, also known as Aymeric de la Châtre, was an influential figure in the papal court during the early 12th century, serving as the papal chancellor under several popes. His role became particularly significant during the contentious papal election of 1130 following Pope Honorius II's death. Aymeric was instrumental in organizing a faction of cardinals that elected Pope Innocent II, with Gregory Papareschi, leading to a schism when another group elected, as we've seen, Anacletus II. Aymeric's alignment with the powerful Roman Frangipani family against the Pierleoni, who backed Anacletus II, was key to his strategy, securing Innocent's position and shaping the course of papal policy in relation also, as we've seen, with the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Lucius II, previously Gerard, cardinal priest of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, had advised both Honorius II and Innocent II on German matters, facilitating the alliance with Lothair III and undertaking 6 missions to Germany between 1125 and 1136. These were necessary because you needed really a papal delegation to set things straight, to travel with a certain level of authority and support. You understand how intertwined these figures are within the Church, but across also Europe, as far as the destinies of the relative regions are concerned. As Pope Lucius II dispatched a respectful letter to King Conrad, urging him to defend the Roman Church. We are told this by the Chronica of Otto Freising, as you know, the famous member of the same, who was a relative of the Hohenstaufen as well, and we looked at him. He's mostly famous for his historiographical insight in the era of Frederick Barbarossa, but also because of the diocese of Freising in Bavaria, that, as we've seen, was in the eye of the storm of some of the most tumultuous feudal ecclesiastical clashes in the era. Eugenius III, 1145-1153, breaks the sort of brief papacies that had series that had preceded him. He was the sole pope in the second quarter of the 12th century not to be previously affiliated with Cardinal Aymeric's faction. However, under the mentorship of Bernard of Clairvaux, thus with surely a general alignment to the, let's say, cooperation, at least between the papacy and the empire, and possibly due to ongoing anti-Norman sentiments within the Curia. There were some international changes that would naturally make factions, alignments float, but these were tendentially, again, times in which the Germanic Empire seemed useful for the papacy due to the peak of Siculo-Norman power, especially under Roger II, that was really relentless in curbing the various rebels and imposing a certain degree of actual control over many parts, especially coastland, mainland, southern Italy. The desire for an imperial partnership persisted, in fact, during the same Eugenius III's papacy. Even though he was not coming from that previous Heimeric, so to say, milieu, he pursued the same policy. Eugenius adeptly secured this alliance in the first year of Frederick I's reign that started under the best auspices regarding the pacification of Germany in the wake of the alliance, essentially, at least the power-sharing agreement between the Welfen and the Hohenstaufen. As you know, Franconia, Swabia were fundamentally under the Hohenstaufen, whereas Saxony and Bavaria were under Henry the Lion. Frederick's own mother was a Welfen. The general understanding was that resources were coming back, let's say, because of the general temper of the time. Germany was growing. Frederick Barbarossa, as you know, would bring in the country like that fully fledged Western Frankish feudalism, courtly culture, knightly training. That's also how he would organize his poderous expeditions to Italy, pursuing therefore that Roman Mediterranean universal dream. There is another part of Germany that is in fact in the north, in the east, and is represented by his cousin Henry the Lion, that, as you know, like went as far as Sweden. He was a great proponent and supporter of the Ostsiedlung. 19th century German historiography would naturally have a lot to say about all this stuff, and I have made enough medieval Germany videos to have sort of interesting things. One of the few, say, I'm satisfied of on the channel that can explain that. But we take also things step by step, including looking at this aspect. In the case of the papacy here, of course, it was evident that the reactivation of a strong German monarchy could be a problem for the papacy. But remember, the papacy here had been ousted from Rome, and from quite some time. So there was a lot that could be exchanged for that imperial crown in terms of support. Then, as you know, today we don't look really at the reign of Frederick as a whole, but you know how the clash between the papacy and the empire re-escalated with the Lombard League subsidized by the Pope and so on. That's another story. Today we look mostly at this sort of beginnings, when we wouldn't even know when or how such attrition would manifest. The Treaty of Constance on March 23rd, 1153, the same city that would witness the peace and the affirmation of the peace within the affirmation of the communes 36 years later, stipulated that Frederick would restore the temporal authority of St. Peter. This is a very big statement for an emperor, especially after the investiture controversy. Frederick Barbarossa was coming back to Italy with a very interesting mentality. It was in part loaded with revenge. I mean, the notion that the papacy had fundamentally undermined the German monarchy. The Hohenstaufen emerging actually from the ashes of the Franconians, because they were essentially the only nobiliar clan that stuck with them with the Salians at the worst. That they were also in part of Salian blood themselves, because Agnes, the daughter of Henry IV, had been given to Frederick I of Swabia, Duke of Swabia, as the first. So this pact was naturally at Constance marked by the fact of the Roman commune that had expelled the papacy. So the temporal authority of St. Peter in many ways would be obviously restored by Frederick, that had to come to Rome and could not simply think there to invade the papal states and taking them over in the process. It would have never worked. He had bigger issues and ambitions, by the way, in Lombardy that could be the gateway to Rome. Like, Frederick was essentially the only It was the first emperor to really start that sort of more courageous, tough, intent of literally molding the Italic kingdom as the basis of operation for further Mediterranean endeavors. And he went pretty close to winning as well. Among the promises, there was also to defend the papacy's honor, of course, which was a more theological point. Like Rome had the primacy of honor in the world, in Christian church. So there was a sense of loyalty, of course, existing now in Latin Germanic Europe between the empire and the papacy in ways that were way more special, than with the Byzantines, that remained, however, still an actor of dialogue. We will make a video showing the papal connections with with Constantinople, that literally up to Manuel Comnenus basically seemed still like someone who could be used to re-enter Italy and to sort of crush the Normans, as we've seen, and mostly allow the papacy to have control over southern Italy. It could be sort of coastally guarded by the Byzantines, but essentially infiltrated by the papacy. By the way, yet another promise at Constance 1153 was from Frederick's side to refrain from negotiating peace with the Romans, meaning the Commune of Rome, or the King of Sicily, without papal consent, in exchange for receiving, in fact, the same Holy Roman Imperial crown. And this, of course, was fine, because it was in the wake of the normal imperial policy and just the objectives that Frederick had prefixed himself. It was important, first of all, to secure the imperial crown, so the first step was just obvious. The Byzantines would create problems to his expedition, especially triggering the Lombards and other centers like Ancona, for example, against imperial forces. Eugenius, for his part, committed to elevating the empire's honor and to excommunicating the king's adversaries. You can read the constitution of the Treaty of Constance in the Monumenta Germani Historice, Constitutiones 1. The definitive break in the imperial alliance with the papacy would occur slightly afterward under the pontificate of Adrian IV, 1154-1159, which occurs basically on the spot. Like, as you understand, Eugenius III didn't even witness essentially the imperial expedition in consistent terms for him at least to capitalize upon. Adrian goes at war essentially with the emperor. At first, the new pope adopted the policies of his predecessors, while under pressure from both the Romans and the recently crowned King of Sicily, William I. Initially, he had to settle these issues. Adrian even renewed the Treaty of Constance, signed by Eugenius III with Frederick, and also Barbarossa's imperial coronation in Rome in June 1155, that his rival could not see, as he had, of course, passed away. To demonstrate goodwill towards the Pope, Frederick captured Arnold of Brescia, so the heresiarch of the Roman insurrection, a proponent of the reform and the leader of the Roman Commune, and handed him over to the Roman prefect for execution. Right, Frederick knew his deal. He also was one of the great knights of the time. Violence obviously did not impress him. He was a very energetic, iron-fisted, and fiery individual. The heretical issue, by the way, was a big one. Right, the most developed parts of Europe, the Rhineland, the same central northern Italy, Occitania, were swarming with these heretics that were really an anti-establishment system. So the emperor here behaved as an emperor, the pope behaved as a pope, Frederick subsequently returned to Germany, this is after the first expedition, without taking any further action against the Pope's enemies in Rome or in the Kingdom of Sicily, also because, again, there are other things going on. Frederick's first expedition to Italy was very much one to behold from his side, because it was in many ways just both a political and cultural shock, right? He was adversed by so many different polities. He really almost lost his army in the process, so he really tasted the sort of what would happen in the following decades in terms of brutal steel, fire, and blood. The increasing discord between the Pope and the Emperor stemmed partly from Frederick's failure to meet the obligations of the Treaty of Constance in 1155, and partly from Adrian's defensive moves, which ultimately led him to breach the treaty as well. When the situation had normalized, Frederick had gotten his imperial crown and the Pope had been restored in Rome. Now, the Germanic intervention in Italy seemed like a problem, of course, for the papacy, and the Lombards had already sort of sniffed the smoke there, so they began to connect to the papacy. This is not what we're really looking at today, because we never really made videos in depth about even this crucial periods, moments in Holy Roman Imperial history. But that's again why we must look just at papal policy per se, also with the Byzantines and the Normans, to understand what was going on in the meanwhile, because otherwise even just Frederick's wars with the Lombards seem like a regional thing without any broader interconnection, which obviously wasn't. In reaction to William I, by the way, was the new king of Sicily, right? And in reaction to his actions, the Pope formed an alliance, once again, with the key Norman rebels opposed to the Sicilian king, who received support at this time from Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus. This is interesting because, again, alliances would change that quickly, but the perennial instability of the southern Italian mainland, from wrestling from out of Sicilian control, was always used by the papacy to further destabilize this area that, if you think about it, would thus also lose some sort of civic public points to reinforce a pretty robust government like at large the Siculo-Norman was for that day and age. Now, the beleaguered William I proposed generous peace terms to the Pope for this very reason, which included performing homage and fealty, as it was customary for the Sicilian kings, making reparations for recent encroachments on papal territories from the side, in fact, of the same Sicilians, and offering assistance against the Roman Commune, and granting autonomy to the Sicilian Church. These were basically all things that the Siculo-Normans had always provided to the papacy in virtue of vassals of Rome, and in this very exclusive relation with the Papal States. So it's normalization of relations attempted by William. According to Adrian's biographer, that is the Cardinal Boso, in fact the Vita Adriani, Varti, the Pope contemplated accepting this offer, but, quote, but the greater part of the brethren, means the cardinals, was opposed to him. Right. Consequently, the Pope felt obliged to reject William's proposals and declare war against him once again, however, only to be defeated and ultimately compelled to accept the king's terms. This is quite illustrative of the limits, of course, of papal temporal authority in that condition. Again, we're talking about two very different kinds of power. The papal one was greater than the Sicilian one at large, but in a spiritual sense at large, temporal one. So the Hauteville could get what they wanted. And it's interesting to see also how military active the papacy was at large, with the support also of the southern Italian rebels. The Concordat of Benevento, that was, as you know, a southern Italian enclave belonging to the papacy, since it's a Longobards addition to the Roman Church in exchange, saying they're escaping a Norman conquest, thus remaining a very important papal wedge, like within properly Siculo-Norman territory. The Concordat, again finalized on June the 18th, 1156, resolved the territorial issues between the Pope and the Sicilian king entirely in favor of the latter, a consequence of the papal military defeat. You can read the Concordat of Benevento in Monumenta Germaniae Historica in Constitutiones 1. Amidst resistance from most of his cardinals who remained loyal to the Treaty of Constance, that therefore revealed the essential Philo-Germanic alignment rather than Philo-Norman one of these prelates, Adrian struggled to establish a new papal approach. This is interesting because we're in the beginnings of Frederick Barbarossa's reign. Things would naturally escalate in an anti-German direction, so the Norman one would be privileged. Cardinal Boso, again in the Vita Adriani Quarti, chapter 2, noted that Adrian, quote, sent the greater part of his brethren into the Campania, that is, this province in the south of Rome, not Campania at Marittima, that is essentially like just in the south of Rome, the Appia road and so on, enabling the negotiation to the Concordat by the minority of cardinals who shared his vision of the need for a Sicilian alliance, which is quite interesting. Like, these guys were opposing themselves to the negotiation with the Normans, so the Pope essentially convinces them to move away from Rome, where just the loyal supporters of the papal policy decide to ally themselves with the Normans rather than with the Germans that those other cardinals essentially wanted. In June 1156, there is a further change in papal strategy, playing a significant role in the contentious papal election that took place from September the 4th to the 7th, 1151. This brought to the soil of Peter Alexander III and Victor IV by opposing factions of cardinals. Essentially, an anti-pope was elected. You know that Alexander III would be the rightful pope. However, you still see at this point, years later, a major split in the Curia over either the German or the Norman alliance. Supporters of the anti-pope Victor IV perceived both the Concordat and Alexander's ascensions as outcomes of a Sicilian party. So in other words, again, the weaker side, the anti-civilizational one if you want, side with the third worst picture, the one that would have actually undermined more the papacy. The future Alexander III would have been this Sicilian party, and his name was Roland of San Marco, Cardinal Roland. He had already been chancellor under Pope Adrian IV, so it was really a trustee of the previous pope, and of course in line with his pro-Norman policy. The friendship formed in Benevento between Pope Adrian and William of Sicily led to considerable strife and division among the cardinals. As you understand, a development viewed as contrary to the dignity of both the Church and the Empire, right? Forgetting that the Siculo-Normans were literal vassals of the Church, that they had already sided with the Church on multiple occasions against the Germans. It's not like the Church had repaid them too well, but they also had been a bit unreliable, to say the least, and they were quite ambitious. But it was just a matter of balancing things out, and with Frederick Barbarossa becoming ever more aggressive, that seemed like the best policy. It's not like even just the Normans could take over Rome. I mean, it was a risk in theory, but in practice, especially from a Sicilian kingdom, a Sicilian-centered kingdom that had also a lot of different theaters to look at, it's a bit more complicated, as we've seen. Not even Lothair III could simply walk into, say, Apulia and dictate rules. That's not how it worked. Now, as expressed in a letter from the cardinals backing the anti-pope Victor IV, that in fact is not part of the papal enumeration down the line, they stated that they had never agreed to the Benevento alliance, while others, consumed by greed and various promises, zealously defended the treaty and misled many into their misguided beliefs. At least this is what you can read from the letter of the cardinals supporting Victor IV in Raevin's Gesta Friderici Imperatores 62, which is naturally a pro-German source that thus would oppose the papacy in that context of general struggle against the Lombard League. And with this, the Norman influence over Rome, or at least the support towards the papacy. Right? An imperial manifesto from 1160 indicated that during Pope Adrian's tenure, Chancellor Roland, the future Alexander III, and several cardinals had colluded with William of Sicily, as well as with other adversaries of the empire, including representatives of whom the strongest, among the strongest cities in Lombardy, Milan, Brescia, and Piacenza. As you know, these were, especially Milan and Piacenza, so central for the passage through the Po Valley into central Italy itself. So we are at this point, of course, looking at sources that are either from one side or another. There isn't really something that isn't propaganda, in the sense that it's perfectly fine for sources to be ideological. People often confuse that with lack of objectivity. We do know, of course, that these cities were well aligned with the papacy and with the Normans as a consequence, leaving aside even the Byzantines, etc., because it's really that far ranging as an overall phenomenon. What happened in these individual communes could have influences even as far as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? So it is that relevant. I made a video about Conrad Montferrat. I made a video about, well, multiple videos at least about Legnano, also as far as the later the influence on the recalibrating the axis, the compass of European alliances, like in the aftermath of the imperial defeat, concerned that the sort of this maliciously pro-Norman faction might weaken after Pope Adrian's death. These people were accused, right, so the followers of the future Alexander III, of having sworn an oath among themselves to ensure that upon the Pope's death, only a member of their conspiracy would be elected as his successor. This is still Raven, Gesta Friderici Imperatoris 4. This tells you, of course, like it would have been possible. Of course, these cardinals were all people coming from powerful families, noblemen themselves, that had really a lot at stake in general, even outside of their ecclesiastical career and offices. However, it's perfectly understandable in this context to maintain such closeness, and being aware, of course, of the difficulties of standing their ground with such an important opposition that is backed by the same Holy Roman Emperor. We can easily imagine how Frederick was funding those cardinals, having contact with them, and simply supporting the anti-pope that after Adrian was in fact elected, which was a big issue. I mean, here we're reading this only from a relatively narrow standpoint, but you know what Frederick's policy was about. We made some videos about this at large. It's a very famous part of history. By the way, this manifesto, as it's described, also mentions a meeting in Anagni in July 1159 that involved the same Adrian IV, his chancellor, the future pope, and 12 additional cardinals along with envoys from the Lombard cities resisting Frederick's control. Of course, the papacy was actively funding the Lombard League at that point. The 13 cardinals present at Anagni in the south of Rome are identified in 2 papal privileges, confirming their good offices in the papal curia. Anagni was one of the most important papal residences of the ones around Rome. The influence held by this Norman party within the college faced opposition from a faction of imperial supporters. This group was led by 2 curial specialists in German matters. These personal connections were very important because, as we've seen, there had been delegations going over to Germany and to other countries, and knowing, of course, like the key figures there, having matured a specific experience regarding contacts, clientele, was quite crucial also to negotiate back, like in this case with the emperor, behind the Pope's back. We're talking about Octavian, cardinal priest of Santa Cecilia. These are all, by the way, very famous churches in Rome. Guido of Crema, the cardinal priest of Santa Maria in Trastevere. These are very famous churches in Rome you can visit. Of course, these were powerful clergymen connected with, in fact, some of the most important Roman churches, and so weighing in the controlling part of the same role, because there is all a Roman milieu here of noblemen of different forces that, remember, here have also been repressed by, as you see, the same Barbarossa, but essentially in favor of the papacy. So there are some side switchings and so on. Both the aforementioned men later rose to the status of anti-popes, in fact, under Frederick Barbarossa. In fact, the first was, Octavian was the same Victor IV, 1159-1164, and the second, Guido of Crema, Paschal III, 1164-1168. These are anti-popes, by the way. They don't count in the papal nomenclature. Divisions among the cardinals were further intensified by an incident that occurred during the Imperial Assembly in Besançon. So we're in the Kingdom of Burgundy that belonged to the Holy Roman Empire in October 1157, ignited by a papal letter that appeared to characterize imperial dignity as a thief, so a beneficium granted to the Pope, which was essentially a re-edition, basically, of the Investiture controversy, which is interesting because, of course, the Pope would try to, say, point toward that direction, which was typical in Investiture controversy. After all, the Dictatus Papae of Gregory VII was very clear. Basically, it's been a bit overly emphasized as the manifesto of the foundation of the Gregorian reforms, that in fact were not just one reform, and also were not so much connected to Gregory VII as, at least in terms of consequentiality and concrete foundations of the most absolute level, but later popes. However, of course, in this imperial council, everything could be, accused of being against the emperor, especially considering who was patrocinizing that assembly as well. While the so-called Sicilian party viewed this event as proof of the emperor's hostility toward the Roman Church, the opposing faction defended the emperor's stance and criticized the, quote, negligence and inexperience. This is arriving Gesta Friederici Imperatoris 316. of the papal legates present at that assembly, including Chancellor Cardinal Roland and Bernard, Cardinal Priest of San Clemente, yet other very important church in Rome. You understand how delicate these issues are, how difficult it was for the papacy to navigate at these times in history. We often get, again, as I was saying before, the impression that, I don't know, there was one power that sit there and never change. You say the Pope, as if there had been a perennial Pope throughout whole history that had specific ideas of politics. No, like the Papal Curia was a marvel, historically wise, exactly because it was forged through the ages, actually, through this enormous pressure that was received just as the obvious end of a polity that had really a scarce temporal power, right? A very strong spiritual one, but otherwise not much in terms of genuine control of any larger political territorial reality. Only at this point the papacy was struggling for this. In fact, there are some videos that now I will list you that can be really useful. It's beautiful to interpolate, in fact, the temporal and the spiritual dimension, because they were happening at the same time. You know, you can't really separate that. I have medieval papacy, 60 videos. Well, I'm very satisfied to hear from myself that that is the case. They're not obviously too many compared to the 2300, but we are approaching, you know, a scale that is of course welcome, and we should make more videos about the papacy on internet. This is too few. But we talked about the Patrimonium Petri in the metaphysical dimension of sovereignty of the Papal States. We talk about the Apostolic Legates at Dei Honorum et ad Salutem Animarum Vestrarum Fideliter Obedite, which is literally the Gregorian Apostolic Legation, and we arrived there with the chronology at literally the beginning of the 12th century. So you can understand, as far as we were pointing out before, mostly about essentially ambassadors. So it wasn't quite like a a papal legate in the administratively provincial essence of local power of the same church in a hierarchical sense. But in Germany, a lot of that was going on. We've seen it there, in fact, in some episodes. In fact, the wars that had broken out at the time of Henry IV, Henry V, really also up to the beginning of the 12th century in places like the St. Constance, for example, where these councils would be held because it was a way to renovate imperial control there, the sacral authority over the ecclesiastical one. We talk about the Gregorian reforms, a recap that is always useful. So Gregory VII's pontificate as the violent turning point against lay investiture and the clergy. It is extremely important because even though separated temporally from today's chronology, so to say, not too much far away, just a couple of generations, but it shows really how the papacy was able to make leverage on actual armed forces. We've seen today how the Italo-Norman rebels were weaponized against the Haute-Ville of Sicily, so that is such an important topic we'll have to come back to. Made other videos about the later Middle Ages. There is one here about the time Frederick II is a bit too distant, even though, of course, his grandfather was evidently there. Mostly 13th century stuff. I made a video about medieval Lazio that essentially discusses, this is important for today's video because it really shows the compromise, the difficulty that existed in affirming the papal lordship, the papal monarchy over Rome, and how it happened, who contributed to it. Interestingly enough, even the smaller towns around, there are smaller cities around Rome that was acting in almost an imperial fashion, was extending with the Roman army that would remain the strongest in Lazio, of course, its control over smaller cities around, and you understand also why the Commune of Rome rebelled at this point, because they were getting really powerful, and they wanted to wield power on their own, and the papacy sort of compromised it, so what a better chance to exploit this in some way, even though paradoxically, as we've seen, it was not exploited by the emperor that needed a crown, if anything, yet. I made a video about the early Papal-Norman relations, refining holy war Normans, their conquest and military penitence from Leo IX and Alexander II. It's more like a dispositive, disciplinary topic, like how, say, the Crusades happened, even before the Crusades, right? And the Normans, of course, were so instrumental in that. Something closer to this period. Well, this beautiful video from medieval law, early medieval canon law collections from the Council of Nicaea to the Concordat of Worms, that gives you a pretty concrete idea of how the church had been operating up to that point as far as a more ecumenic organization of the same was concerned. This is interesting, the ecclesiological historiographical propaganda of Henry IV's faction against the Gregorians, right? That shows you really how much mud they could throw at one another, and especially from the imperial side, because the papacy was better at it, but the emperors didn't kid either. This video is also very important. Urban II and the Sutri Agreement of 1111 with Henry V, that witnessed ideally the full agreement of the Pope and the Emperor on the respective separation of temporal and spiritual authority, to essentially quell the distrust in the respective fields of supporters, let's say, especially the Emperor in Germany, so apparently settling the right path that was, say, ideally conceived, like the Emperor taking care of the temporal affairs and the papacy of the spiritual ones, but of course, in a fallen world it can't be otherwise. They're always going to interfere, and power is always there, wielded by the priesthood as well. Then what? Roman turbulence and curial itinerancy. This is perfect because it talks about the building of the papal territorial dominion in the 12th century, so you can look at it. It's a brief video, it's like half an hour. It's also one of the least watched, but it's actually very, very important. For the rest, what do we have here? Well, there is all, say, a space for the, the mendicant orders, what was going on. There is all the playlists. This is the medieval papal playlist. There isn't much about heresies per se, unless, the papacy was dealing with them. But the general picture here is, as you understand, complex. Papal history videos are so important. We try to present them in ways that seem more appealing to people who apparently think that just the topic is not. I noticed this throughout all Schwerpunkt's history. Like the notion that people reject the idea that any of this was not just of enormous relevance, but even of relevance. Right, there is half of the world, half of the West, most of that simply, not like the rest of the world cares. So that's talking about Westerners, the ones that matter really, that really have been indoctrinated to resentfully despise the papacy and to pretend to eradicate it, to cancel it from history books, or to relegate it to an infamous position. If you don't know papal history, you don't know the history of any other place in the world in any era. Like, knowing what was happening at this point is like the key to the Middle Ages. If you don't understand the stuff, zero. You can study an entire country, whatever you fixate on, forever. You will never understand anything about it, because everything passed from Rome, and everybody was working on that basis. So this is such a relevant topic, it can't pass unnoticed. How long was this video? Probably an hour and a half, something like that. Yeah, I'm into making mostly 2 hours long videos because they are more interesting in many ways. But I try to do it by filling them with anecdotes, and especially in the last part, you have more information about other videos I've made, and I waste a bit of time in this way. However, the length is good. Like, I try to keep this rhythm as it seems to be more profitable. In many ways, we tend to learn more, to agglutinate more, to reflect more on what is going on, and all this has to form a great single picture. All right, and it may not be that self-evident, meaning that when we look at the, for example, papal history in basic terms like this, 60 videos are too few. You don't cover satisfactorily anything. Like, even if I had made 120, it would be major gaps in the broader narrative that will have to be filled. We never talk about the Western Schism, guys. And in part, I confess, like, that if I were to make more content, more specials, I know I do it in part also because of any video that can promote the channel, etc. But we will absolutely have to cover all the stuff in thorough detail, not just some detail, right? We have to get to places where nobody has ever gotten to begin with, and the history of the papacy must be known. It's also weird, and if you look at the trends here, for example, the other day I made a video about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. I said this video is basically not going to be watched because also other videos about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons I think were kind of okay, but usually when I talk about ecclesiastical history, magically people don't watch. Who knows why? It's terrible. I am saying that, like, there is no excuse. It's really, like, insulting, not to me, but to the average intelligence, really, for all the aforementioned reasons and more. The other day I made this video about the Anglo-Saxon evangelization. It was a beautiful video. I liked it. I mean, it was relatively contained. It lasted almost a couple of hours, and it was important and interesting. And it booms. Not too many views, but here I'm getting almost 1,000, basically 1,000 or more, 1,100 in 48 hours. I make a video about, I don't know, medieval Western European infantry, 12th century, the medieval tournament. This was a beautiful video, 2 hours long. People don't watch them, or at least they watch them half or 1/3 of the rest. Like, the question is, I understand that you may not be much into it, but the question is, I remember the days in which people wanted to know how reality worked, how armies worked, how it was cool to be a person who understands reality, and how to make it work, and how to wield power, and how to move armies, etc. Today, it seems to me that the only videos that get watched are the ones that get any kind of ethnic or ideological impression, or that look as if they have a patina of that on them. And it is disappointing because it's just emotionalism. It's not like those are not good videos. I'm happy that the Anglo-Saxon evangelization got so many views. Like, thank God. Like, it's also a beautiful English history topic just per se, right? Aside from the broader Catholic, Roman, and imperial implication. The question is, it can't get down to just this, right? There are so many videos that you see, I make them with the same spirit, I make them with the same insight, I make them with the same purpose, right? It's not like you watch this video, it's fundamentally different from the other. I'm not serving you different dishes that you have to choose which. This is part of the world narrative. It's a single one. If you don't understand this, you don't understand tradition, right? And as such, I think that there is an incredible relevance in what this channel has to offer that gets completely skipped. for no reason, for the sense that you are, able to just, I don't know, think that I make Christian history videos because I'm a Christian, or I'm factionalistic about it, or whatever, and you don't even know anything about me, also because I haven't told you anything about me. That's not why I'm here. And unfortunately, it weighs. It weighs on the statistics, it weighs on the capacity of the channel to grow, because naturally, it's not like you can watch everything. I understand that you tend to watch, of course, as much as you can. So I'm not complaining about that. I know it's tough out there. I'm not pretending you to be glued on my videos, etc. But the this other video, like it's unfortunately damaging the channel. It's unfortunately making it lag behind. It's unfortunately making it buried under simplified history nonsense, just because there are pictures on it, right? This is so ridiculous, really, that I don't know whether... So I know it's worth it to keep making videos and everything, because I think that sooner or later this thing will take off in a much greater way than it's ever done. But let's say this only delays it, right? So even if you don't want to watch the video, like, at least when you're listening to the other, given that it's mostly just like a podcast of some sort, why don't you share it on, I don't know, 20 Facebook groups or somewhere, I don't know, on Reddit, whatever. That helps. That even if you don't want to watch it, there are people who are going to watch them and help in this direction, right? So it's incredibly important. It can't be bypassed. It's all part of the general balance, the general equilibrium of the world. And I think we must really be honest about where we want Schwerpunkt to go. Because I knew it would take a while, but if we lengthen that further, it's not really good for anyone involved, right? So, papal history. I know I'm making all this speech now because this is papal history, and I already know that there is that bias out there. It's shameful. Again, if you call yourself a European, or you attach importance to your European ancestry, if you care about the imperial Catholic tradition, and you don't understand that you must know papal history in depth in order to have any minimal chance to even think to be able to live up to this legacy, I think the latter will never happen. just for saying. Also because there is literally no other way. But it's hard. I understand it's hard. I understand it's unpopular. I understand it's difficult. But this is also why I'm here. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.